The summer heat pressed down on Cleveland's downtown streets like a heavy blanket, the kind that makes asphalt shimmer and turns sidewalks into griddles. It was August 16th, 1997, and the city hummed with the energy of a Saturday night wedding celebration that spilled out from the elegant ballroom of the Renaissance Hotel into the warm evening air. 23-year-old Jessica Martinez adjusted the deep burgundy silk of her bridesmaid dress as she walked alongside her best friend Amy Thompson, their heels clicking against the concrete in perfect synchronization. They had known each other since childhood, growing up in the same neighborhood in Lakewood, sharing secrets, dreams, and now this perfect night, celebrating their college roommate's wedding. The reception had been everything a fairy tale wedding should be. Flowing champagne, a 7-piece band that kept everyone dancing until their feet ached, and that magical moment when the bride tossed a bouquet directly into Jessica's waiting hands. The two young women had stepped outside for a breath of fresh air, their cheeks flushed from dancing and laughter, completely unaware that they were about to vanish from the face of the earth. If you're watching this story unfold, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. Now, let's continue with what happened that fateful night. The wedding photographer, David Kowalski, would later tell police that it captured the last known image of Jessica and Amy at 11:47 p.m., standing near the hotel's revolving doors. In the photograph, Jessica's dark hair caught the light from the lobby's crystal chandeliers, while Amy's blonde curls framed her face as she threw her head back in laughter. They looked radiant, alive, completely ordinary, just two young women enjoying the best night of their lives. The plan had been simple enough. Amy's car was parked 3 blocks away in a municipal lot on East 6th Street, and they had decided to walk rather than wait for the valet. The streets were well-lit and busy with other wedding guests, bar patrons, and typical downtown Saturday night foot traffic. Jessica had her small beaded purse slung over her shoulder, containing her lipstick, a $20 bill, and the keys to her apartment. Amy carried a slightly larger clutch with her camera, some cash, and a small bottle of aspirin for what she jokingly called her dancing feet. According to witness statements collected by the Cleveland Police Department, the two women were seen walking east on Superior Avenue at approximately midnight. A couple leaving a nearby jazz club noticed them because of their elegant dresses and the way they seemed to float rather than walk. Still caught up in the magic of the evening, the witnesses, Robert and Linda Chun, would tell Detective Frank Russo that the young women appeared completely normal, talking animatedly, occasionally pausing to adjust their shoes, completely unaware of any danger. But somewhere between Superior Avenue and the parking lot on East 6th Street, Jessica Martinez and Amy Thompson simply vanished. When Amy's boyfriend, Michael Torres, arrived at her apartment the next morning with coffee and bagels, expecting to hear every detail of the wedding, he found no trace of her. When Jessica's parents called her apartment throughout Sunday afternoon, growing increasingly worried, they heard only the hollow ring of an unanswered phone. The initial police response was frustratingly routine. Detective Russo, a 20-year veteran of the force who had seen his share of missing persons cases, initially treated it as two young women who might have changed their plans, perhaps meeting some interesting men at the wedding and deciding to extend their night. Young people do impulsive things, he told the frantic families on Monday morning. Give it 48 hours. But as those 48 hours stretched into 72, then a week, it became clear that this was something far more sinister. Amy's car remained untouched in the parking lot, her keys found on the driver's seat as if she had unlocked the door but never gotten inside. Jessica's purse was discovered 2 days later in a dumpster behind a restaurant on Euclid Avenue, its contents intact except for any identification. The crime scene, if it could be called that, yielded no blood, no signs of struggle, no witnesses who had seen anything suspicious. The families hired private investigator Catherine Walsh, a former FBI agent who specialized in missing persons cases. Walsh immediately noticed what the police had overlooked. The positioning of Amy's keys suggested she had been interrupted while trying to enter her vehicle. Someone approached them in the car, she told the families during a tense meeting in the Martinez family's living room. The question is whether they went willingly or were forced. As autumn painted Cleveland's trees in shades of gold and crimson, the case began to consume the lives of everyone involved. Jessica's mother, Rosa Martinez, quit her job at the medical center to dedicate herself full-time to searching for her daughter. She created flyers, organized search parties, and called the police department daily, becoming such a fixture that the desk sergeant would recognize her voice before she identified herself. Amy's parents, Patricia and James Thompson, mortgaged their house to increase the reward fund, believing that money might loosen someone's tongue. The investigation expanded to include the FBI, bringing in Agent Sarah Kim, who specialized in abduction cases. The federal involvement brought sophisticated resources, advanced forensic techniques, behavioral analysis, and a nationwide database search for similar cases. Agent Kim's profile suggested the women had encountered someone they knew, or at least someone who appeared trustworthy enough for them to lower their guard. Months passed with false leads and dead ends. A psychic from Akron claimed to have visions of the women trapped in an underground facility. A convicted felon in Mansfield confessed to their murder during a drug-induced rampage, but his story fell apart under scrutiny. A homeless man reported seeing two women matching their description getting into a dark sedan near the lake, but he couldn't remember which day, which street, or any details about the vehicle. The case grew cold as winter settled over Cleveland, the lake-effect snow burying the city under layers of white that seemed to muffle hope itself. Detective Russo kept the files on his desk, reviewing them during quiet moments, but new cases demanded his attention. The family's vigils grew smaller. The media moved on to fresher tragedies, and Jessica and Amy became just two more faces on missing person posters that gradually faded and curled at the edges. But Rosa Martinez refused to let her daughter disappear twice. She transformed her living room into a command center, walls covered with maps, timelines, and photographs. She learned to use a computer, joining early internet forums dedicated to missing persons cases, connecting with other families across the country who shared her nightmare. She drove the streets of Cleveland every weekend, talking to homeless individuals, shop owners, and anyone who might have seen something that August night. Patricia Thompson approached the mystery differently, focusing on Amy's personal life. Convinced that the answer lay hidden in her daughter's relationships or activities, she interviewed Amy's college friends repeatedly, searching for any detail that might have been overlooked. She discovered that Amy had been receiving hang-up phone calls in the weeks before the wedding, something Amy had mentioned casually but never pursued. She learned that Amy had been carrying more cash than usual that night, having recently received a small inheritance from her grandmother. The breakthrough came not through investigation, but through tragedy. In March 1998, 7 months after the disappearance, a warehouse fire on Cleveland's east side killed a security guard and revealed something that would haunt investigators for years to come. Hidden in a storage unit rented under a false name, firefighters discovered a collection of women's clothing, jewelry, and personal items that appeared to be trophies. Among them was a burgundy silk bridesmaid's dress, torn and stained with what forensic analysis would confirm as human blood. Detective Russo stood in the charred remains of the warehouse, staring at the evidence bag containing Jessica's dress. The fabric still held traces of her perfume, a floral scent that seemed obscenely innocent in this context. The storage unit contained items from at least 12 different women, spanning several years, but Jessica's dress was the only item that could be definitively connected to a known victim. The warehouse belonged to Preston Industries, a small trucking company with routes throughout the Midwest. The company's owner, Harold Preston, had died in the fire while apparently trying to retrieve something from the storage area. Police found his body clutched around a metal briefcase containing false identification documents and detailed photographs of various women, including several shots of Jessica and Amy taken, without their knowledge, in the days leading up to the wedding. Agent Kim's investigation into Harold Preston revealed a carefully constructed double life. To the business community, he was a successful entrepreneur who employed 15 people and donated regularly to local charities. He lived alone in a modest house in Shaker Heights, attended church regularly, and was considered a pillar of the community by his neighbors. But his business gave him the perfect cover for a predatory lifestyle. His trucks traveled extensively, his drivers were often on the road for days at a time, and his warehouse provided isolated spaces for activities that couldn't bear scrutiny. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit painted a picture of a methodical predator who had been operating for years. Preston's truck drivers were interviewed extensively, and a pattern emerged of missing persons along his company's regular routes. Women in Detroit, Indianapolis, and Columbus had vanished under circumstances similar to Jessica and Amy's disappearance. Young, attractive, and abducted from areas where Preston's trucks were known to have made deliveries. But Preston's death in the warehouse fire meant that Jessica and Amy's fate might never be fully known. The storage unit contained no bodies, no clear evidence of murder, only the horrifying collection of personal items that suggested the worst possible outcome. The blood on Jessica's dress matched her DNA profile, constructed from hair samples provided by her family, but there wasn't enough to determine whether she had survived the initial assault. The investigation into Preston's activities consumed the next 2 years. FBI agents traced his movements through credit card receipts, truck logs, and security footage from dozens of locations. They discovered a network of abandoned properties he had purchased under various names: old farms, vacant warehouses, and remote cabins that could have served as holding facilities. Each location was searched thoroughly, but time, weather, and deliberate concealment had erased most traces of what might have occurred there. Rosa Martinez aged a decade in those 2 years. Her once dark hair turned silver, lines etched themselves deeply around her eyes, and her voice took on the hollow quality of someone who has screamed into the void too many times. But she never stopped searching, never stopped believing that somewhere, somehow, her daughter might still be alive. She visited every property connected to Preston, walking through empty rooms and overgrown fields, calling Jessica's name into the silence. Patricia Thompson took a different path, channeling her grief into advocacy. She worked with lawmakers to improve missing person protocols, push for faster FBI involvement in abduction cases, and create a foundation that provided resources to other searching families. She spoke at conferences and appeared on television, always wearing a small pin with Amy's photograph, keeping her daughter's memory alive in the public consciousness. The case officially remained open, though active investigation gradually wound down as other priorities emerged. Detective Russo retired in 2003, passing the files to a younger detective who promised to continue the work, but had dozens of other cases demanding attention. Agent Kim moved on to other assignments. Though she kept copies of the case files and occasionally reviewed them during quiet moments, still haunted by the questions that would never be answered. As the years passed, Cleveland changed around the memory of Jessica Martinez and Amy Thompson. Downtown was revitalized with new restaurants and entertainment venues. The Renaissance Hotel was renovated and rebranded. The parking lot where Amy's car was found was developed into luxury condominiums. The physical spaces where their story began were transformed, but the mystery remained frozen in time, unchanging and unresolved. The family's annual memorial services grew smaller each year, attended by fewer friends and relatives as people move away or simply move on with their lives. But Rosa Martinez and Patricia Thompson never miss a year, standing together in Holy Family Cemetery, where empty headstones mark the space where their daughters should have been buried. They aged together, their grief creating a bond deep in friendship. Two mothers united by the worst possible loss. In 2010, 13 years after the disappearance, a construction crew renovating the old warehouse district discovered human remains buried beneath a concrete slab that had been poured in 1997, just weeks after Jessica and Amy vanished. The bones were fragmentary, damaged by time and the industrial chemicals that had leached into the soil. But DNA analysis confirmed what the families had known in their hearts for years. Jessica Martinez and Amy Thompson were finally coming home. The discovery brought a measure of closure, but also fresh anguish. The forensic anthropologist's report painted a clinical picture of what their daughters had endured. Details too horrible for the families to fully process. There was evidence of prolonged captivity, of systematic abuse, of lives that had ended in unimaginable terror and pain. Harold Preston had taken his secrets to the grave, but the physical evidence spoke with devastating clarity about the final chapters of two young lives. Rosa Martinez stood at her daughter's grave for the first time in 15 years, her weather hands trembling as she placed a bouquet of white roses on the freshly turned earth. The headstone was simple granite with Jessica's name, birth date, and the date she had vanished, because no one could determine exactly when her life had ended. Beside her, Patricia Thompson wept quietly, finally able to grieve for a daughter she could now properly bury. The trial of Harold Preston would never happen, but the investigation into his crimes continued even after his death. Federal agents eventually connected him to the disappearances of at least 8 other women across 4 states, creating one of the most extensive serial killing sprees in Midwest history. His trucking business had provided the perfect cover, allowing him to hunt across state lines while maintaining the appearance of a legitimate businessman. Detective Frank Russo, now retired but still haunted by the case, attended Jessica's funeral. He sat in the back of St. Joseph's Cathedral, watching 2 families finally say goodbye to daughters who'd been stolen from them on what should have been the happiest night of their lives. The church was packed with people who had never stopped hoping, never stopped searching, never stopped believing that love could somehow overcome the darkest human evil. The story of Jessica Martinez and Amy Thompson became part of Cleveland's collective memory, a reminder that evil could strike anywhere, anytime, without warning or reason. But it also became a testament to the power of love that refuses to surrender, of families who would not let their children vanish without a trace, of communities that rally around those who suffer unimaginable loss. Years later, when people asked Rosa Martinez how she survived 27 years of not knowing, she would point to a photograph on her mantel, Jessica in her burgundy bridesmaid's dress, laughing with pure joy, frozen forever in that moment of perfect happiness. "I survived," she would say, "because love doesn't disappear, it just changes form." In 2024, 27 years after that August night, the final piece of Jessica and Amy's story would surface in the most unexpected way possible. A city transit worker conducting routine maintenance on a retired bus schedule for scrapping made a discovery that would send shockwaves through Cleveland's law enforcement community and bring the Martinez and Thompson families back into the harsh glare of media attention they thought they had left behind forever. Bus number 4127 had been in service on various downtown routes from 1995 to 2018 before being retired to the municipal maintenance yard. Transit worker Danny Rodriguez was removing seats to salvage usable parts when his crowbar struck something wedged deep beneath the rear bench seat. What he pulled out was a plastic evidence bag containing a blood-stained wedding veil, yellow with age, but still recognizably the delicate lace and pearl creation that bride Jennifer Walsh had worn on August 16, 1997. The discovery sent investigators scrambling to piece together a puzzle that had seemed complete. The veil had never been reported missing from the wedding, never mentioned in any of the original witness statements, never appeared in any of the evidence collected from Harold Preston's storage unit. Its presence in the bus suggested that Jessica and Amy's abduction had been even more complex than anyone had imagined, involving multiple locations and possibly multiple perpetrators. Detective Maria Santos, who had inherited the cold case files, found herself reopening an investigation that had been considered solved for over a decade. The blood on the veil matched Jessica Martinez's DNA, but forensic analysis revealed something troubling. The blood pattern suggested the veil had been deliberately placed in the bus, not lost during a struggle or accidentally dropped. Someone had wanted it to be found, but only after enough time had passed for the trail to grow cold. Transit authorities' records showed that Bus 4127 had been assigned to Route 15, which ran from downtown Cleveland through several residential neighborhoods, including areas near some of Harold Preston's known properties. But in 1997, the bus had been operating on Route 8, which covered a completely different section of the city, nowhere near where Jessica and Amy had disappeared or where Preston's warehouse had been located. Driver logs from August 1997 were incomplete, damaged by years of storage in basement archives that had flooded multiple times. But transit supervisor Margaret O'Brien, now in her 70s and long retired, remembered that weekend clearly because of staffing shortages that had forced several route changes. "We had 3 drivers call in sick," she told Detective Santos during an interview at her assisted living facility. "Harold Kowalski was supposed to work Route 15, but we moved him to Route 8 because that's where we needed coverage most." Harold Kowalski, no relation to the wedding photographer David Kowalski, had been a transit employee for 12 years before retiring in 2001. His personnel file showed a clean record, excellent performance reviews, and no disciplinary actions. But when Detective Santos attempted to locate him for questioning, she discovered that Harold Kowalski had died a heart attack in 2019, taking whatever secrets he might have known to his grave. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Santos contacted Kowalski's widow, Eleanor, who still lived in the couple's modest home in Parma. Eleanor Kowalski was a frail woman in her 80s, her memory clouded by the early stages of dementia, but she became agitated when Detective Santos mentioned the bus routes, and that weekend in August 1997. "Harold came home so late that night," Eleanor whispered, clutching a faded photograph of her husband in his transit uniform. "He said there had been trouble downtown, something about helping some girls who were in danger. He was upset, wouldn't eat dinner, kept washing his hands over and over. I asked him what happened, but he just said some things were too terrible to talk about." Eleanor's fragmented memories painted a picture of a man haunted by something he had witnessed or been forced to participate in. She remembered that Harold had started having nightmares around that time, waking up screaming about buses and blood and young women calling for help. She had suggested he see a doctor, but Harold had refused, insisting that time would heal whatever was troubling him. As Detective Santos dug deeper into Harold Kowalski's life, she discovered connections that the original investigation had missed. Kowalski had grown up in the same neighborhood as Harold Preston, had attended the same high school, and had served in the Army at the same time, though in different units. Property records showed that Kowalski owned a small cabin in rural Geauga County, purchased in 1995 and sold hastily in late 1997 for significantly less than its assessed value. The new cabin owner, a retired school teacher named Robertson, had always wondered about the strange modifications made to property's basement. The previous owner had installed soundproofing materials, reinforced locks on interior doors, and a ventilation system that seemed excessive for such a small space. Shin had assumed it was meant to be a workshop or music room, but he had never been able to shake the feeling that something darker had occurred there. FBI forensic teams descended on the cabin in November 2024, using ground-penetrating radar and advanced DNA testing techniques that hadn't existed during the original investigation. What they found confirmed everyone's worst fears: traces of blood in the basement walls, DNA evidence from multiple victims, and a hidden compartment containing personal items from women who had disappeared across Ohio and Pennsylvania between 1995 and 1997. Among the recovered items was Amy Thompson's camera, its film still intact after 27 years. When the photographs were finally developed, they revealed the last images Amy had taken. Pictures of Jessica laughing at the wedding reception, shots of the band and dancing guests, and then, horrifyingly, several frames that documented their abduction. The final photograph showed the interior of Harold Kowalski's bus, Jessica and Amy looking confused and frightened, and the shadowy figure of a man whose face was partially obscured, but whose transit uniform was clearly visible. The revelation that Harold Kowalski had been involved in the abductions sent shockwaves through Cleveland's transit community and the families of the victims. Rosa Martinez, now in her 70s and suffering from heart problems brought on by decades of stress, could barely process the news that her daughter's killer had been hiding in plain sight, driving city buses and living a normal life while she had spent years searching for answers. Patricia Thompson's reaction was different, but equally devastating. She had ridden bus route 8 dozens of times during her own searches for Amy, unknowingly sitting just feet away from the man who had participated in her daughter's murder. The realization that she might have looked into Kowalski's eyes, might have exchanged pleasantries about the weather or the city's traffic, made her physically ill. The investigation revealed that Harold Preston and Harold Kowalski had been partners in a predatory scheme that had operated for years. Preston would identify potential victims through his trucking business, following women and learning their routines. Kowalski would then use his position as a bus driver to either transport victims to Preston's holding locations or to dispose of evidence after murders. The city bus had been a perfect cover. Who would suspect a municipal employee in uniform of being involved in abductions? Eleanor's deteriorating mental state made her an unreliable witness, but she provided enough fragments of memory to suggest that her husband had been trapped in a partnership against his will. She remembered arguments between Harold and an unnamed friend, heated phone conversations about getting out and not doing this anymore. She recalled finding her husband crying one morning in 1997, saying he had done something terrible and could never take it back. Whether Harold Kowalski had been a willing participant or a coerced accomplice might never be known, but the evidence suggested that the murders had taken a devastating psychological toll on him. His work performance had declined after 1997. He had begun drinking heavily and sought treatment for depression and anxiety. The sale of the cabin and his eventual retirement seemed to mark his attempt to escape from whatever demons were haunting him. The discovery of Amy's camera photographs provided investigators with their first clear timeline of what happened on August 16, 1997. The images showed that Jessica and Amy had made it to the parking lot safely, had found Amy's car, and had been preparing to leave when they were approached by Harold Kowalski in his city bus. The photographs suggested they had gotten onto the bus voluntarily, perhaps thinking they were being offered a ride or help with some fabricated emergency. Once on the bus, they had been transported to Kowalski's cabin, where Harold Preston was waiting. The physical evidence from the cabin painted a horrific picture of their final hours. DNA samples, fiber evidence, and traces of restraints that confirmed the women had been held captive and tortured before being killed. Their bodies had then been transported back to Cleveland and buried beneath the warehouse, where they were eventually discovered in 2010. The wedding veil found in the bus had been deliberately placed there by someone with access to both the evidence and the transit system's maintenance facilities. Forensic analysis suggested it had been hidden in the bus sometime between 2010 and 2015, years after both Preston and Kowalski were dead. This meant that a third person had been involved in the crimes, someone who was still alive and who had chosen to reveal this final piece of evidence for reasons that remain unclear. Detective Santos expanded her investigation to include anyone who might have had access to both the original crime scene evidence and the transit maintenance yard. The list was surprisingly long. Police officers, FBI agents, forensic technicians, transit supervisors, and maintenance workers all underwent background checks. But Santos knew that predators could hide behind badges and uniforms just as easily as they could behind business suits. The break came from an unexpected source. Janet Walsh, the bride whose wedding had been the last happy memory in Jessica and Amy's lives, contacted Detective Santos after seeing news coverage of the veil's discovery. Janet, now divorced and living in Florida, had something she had never reported to police. In the weeks following her wedding, she had received several anonymous letters containing details about the disappearances that had never been made public. The letters, which Janet had kept in a box of wedding memorabilia, were written in block printing on plain paper. They described Jessica and Amy's final hours in chilling detail, mentioned the cabin and the bus, and included information about Harold Preston that wouldn't be discovered for years. But most importantly, they contained threats against Janet herself, warnings that she would suffer the same fate if she ever revealed what she had been told. "I was terrified," Janet told Detective Santos during a video interview from her home in Tampa. "I had just gotten married. I was starting a new life, and these letters made it clear that whoever killed Jessica and Amy was still out there, still watching. I convinced myself that going to the police would just put more people in danger. So I moved away and tried to forget it ever happened." The letters were analyzed by the FBI's Document Examination Unit, which determined they had been written by someone with law enforcement training. The writer knew details about crime scene procedures, evidence handling, and investigative protocols that suggested intimate familiarity with police work. More troubling, the letters reference ongoing investigation activities that had not been released to the public, indicating that the writer had access to confidential case files. Detective Santos found herself investigating her own department, examining the backgrounds and activities of everyone who had worked on the original case. It was uncomfortable work, questioning colleagues and former colleagues, but the evidence pointed clearly towards someone within the law enforcement community. The fact that the veil had been preserved and hidden for decades suggested someone who understood both the legal system and the emotional impact its discovery would have on the families. The answer came from an unexpected confession. Former FBI agent Thomas Bradley, who had worked on the periphery of the original investigation, contacted Detective Santos in January 2025 and requested a meeting. Bradley, now retired and battling terminal cancer, said he had information about the Jessica Martinez and Amy Thompson case that he needed to share before he died. Bradley's confession painted a picture of corruption and cover-up that reached into the highest levels of local law enforcement. He revealed that Harold Kowalski had been an FBI informant, providing information about drug activity and other crimes he observed during his bus routes. When Kowalski became involved with Harold Preston's murders, Bradley had been assigned to manage the informant relationship and had made the decision to protect Kowalski rather than expose the crimes. "I thought I could control the situation," Bradley told Detective Santos, his voice weak but clear. Kowalski was providing intelligence on major drug operations. "I convinced myself that the greater good justified protecting him, that we could prevent future crimes while still getting valuable information about other cases. It was the worst decision I've ever made, and it haunted me every day for 27 years. Bradley's protection of Kowalski had involved suppressing evidence, misdirecting the investigation away from the bus routes, and ensuring that Kowalski's name never appeared in any official reports. When Harold Preston died in the warehouse fire, Bradley had seen an opportunity to end the arrangement while still protecting the FBI's investment in Kowalski as an informant. But Kowalski's psychological deterioration after the murders had made him increasingly unreliable and dangerous. Bradley had been forced to gradually distance the Bureau from its informant while still maintaining enough contact to ensure Kowalski's silence. The stress of managing this impossible situation had contributed to Bradley's own mental health problems and early retirement from the FBI. The wedding veil had been Bradley's attempt at redemption. After Kowalski's death in 2019, Bradley had retrieved the veil from evidence storage and placed it in the bus, knowing that the vehicle's eventual scrapping would lead to its discovery. He had hoped that the physical evidence would provide closure for the families, while still protecting the FBI from the scandal that would result if his actions were exposed. "I couldn't live with what I had done," Bradley explained, tears streaming down his gaunt face. "Those families deserve to know the truth, but I was too much of a coward to tell them directly. I thought if the veil was found, it might answer some of their questions without destroying any more lives. I know it was selfish, but I was trying to find some way to make amends." Bradley's confession opened the door to a federal investigation that would ultimately expose a network of corruption involving multiple law enforcement agencies. Harold Kowalski had been providing information to at least 3 different agencies, creating a complex web of competing interests and compromised investigations. The decision to protect him had been made at levels far above Bradley's authority, involving supervisors who had long since retired or died. The revelation that Jessica Martinez and Amy Thompson had been murdered by men who were supposed to protect the public, and that their deaths had been covered up by federal agents, sparked outrage across Cleveland and beyond. Protesters gathered outside FBI headquarters, demanding accountability and reform. Civil rights organizations filed lawsuits seeking damages for the families and changes to informant handling procedures. Rosa Martinez lived just long enough to hear Thomas Bradley's full confession. She died peacefully in her sleep on February 14, 2025, surrounded by family members who had watched her fight for justice for nearly 3 decades. Her last coherent words were about Jessica, expressing hope that her daughter could finally rest in peace now that the truth had been revealed. Patricia Thompson survived to see the federal investigation conclude with criminal charges against several retired FBI agents and the implementation of new oversight procedures for informant handling. She testified before Congress about the need for accountability in law enforcement and the devastating impact that corruption could have on crime victims' families. At age 76, she became an unlikely advocate for police reform, channeling her grief into a determination to prevent other families from suffering as hers had. The final chapter of Jessica Martinez and Amy Thompson's story was written not in Cleveland's courtrooms or in the pages of investigative reports, but in the quiet moments when their memory brought comfort to others facing similar losses. Their names became symbols of persistence in the face of impossible odds, of love that refuses to surrender, and of the terrible price that corruption exacts from innocent victims. The Renaissance Hotel, where their last happy moments had been captured by a photographer's camera, installed a small memorial plaque in their honor. The text was simple: "In memory of Jessica Martinez and Amy Thompson, whose light continues to shine in the darkness." Every year on August 16th, someone leaves fresh flowers beneath the plaque. Sometimes family members, sometimes strangers who have been touched by their story. Always people who understand that some losses are too profound to forget. In the end, the mystery of what happened to 2 bridesmaids who vanished near downtown Cleveland in 1997 became more than just a true crime story. It became a testament to the power of truth, however delayed, to provide healing. It demonstrated that justice, even when imperfect and incomplete, can still offer redemption to those who refuse to stop seeking it. And it proved that love, the love of families who never gave up, the love of communities that rallied around the grieving, the love that connects us all to one another, is the only force powerful enough to transform unspeakable tragedy into lasting meaning. The bloodied veil discovered inside bus 4127 was a final piece of evidence in a case that spanned nearly 3 decades. But it was also something more profound. Proof that secrets, no matter how carefully buried, will eventually find their way to surface. Jessica Martinez and Amy Thompson had been silenced by their killers, abandoned by a system that should protect them, and forgotten by a world that had moved on to newer tragedies. But their voices, speaking to the evidence they left behind and the love of those who refused to let them go, ultimately proved stronger than all the forces that had tried to erase them from history.